What if I told you that the greatest threat to your freedom comes not from evil, but from stupidity? Not from naive stupidity, the kind that slips into simple mistakes, but from a more subtle and dangerous force, one that disguises itself as common sense, that spreads among intelligent people, and that causes even the most lucid minds to abandon their ability to think. A force that Dietrich Bonhoeffer, theologian, thinker, and martyr, identified as a threat even greater than evil itself. Not a visible threat like tyranny, but a fog that infiltrates the collective consciousness, anesthetizing thought, corrupting discernment, making error acceptable and doubt unbearable. It's hard to accept this, because we grew up believing that intelligence is enough to protect someone from error. That knowledge is enough, that information saves, that accumulating diplomas and titles is enough to guarantee lucidity. But Bonhoeffer saw otherwise, and he didn't see it from afar. He witnessed with his own eyes the moral collapse of Nazi Germany. He saw pastors praying for cruel leaders. He saw teachers justifying crimes in the name of order. He saw neighbors turning in neighbors as if fulfilling a civic duty. And they weren't ignorant. They were educated, cultured people, many of them well-intentioned. What failed wasn't intellectual capacity. It was the courage to think for oneself when thinking became dangerous. What disappeared wasn't logical reasoning, but the integrity of conscience. Bonhoeffer understood with painful clarity that stupidity is not an absence. It is a choice. It is the moment when someone, out of fear, fatigue, or convenience, surrenders their conscience and agrees to think with the mind of another. It is when someone becomes a vessel for ideas they do not understand, a defender of causes they have not analyzed, a repeater of phrases they have heard many times and never questioned. It is when consciousness becomes an opaque mirror, reflecting only what is already outside. And the most disturbing thing, this surrender doesn't happen with warning. It happens gradually, when we stop doubting, when we stop listening, when we seek quick certainties instead of difficult truths, when we prefer being right to being aware, when we confuse security with truth, when we become intolerant of complexity and hostage to comforting simplicity. Bonhoeffer observed this in silence, amid the deafening din of a country marching toward the abyss. While many celebrated the new order, he wrote letters in secret, reflecting on what had truly led his society astray. And the conclusion was grim. The greatest enemy was not the tyrant, but the obedient citizen. It was not open hatred, but cowardice disguised as loyalty. It was not obvious evil, but functional stupidity. A stupidity that thinks it is doing good, that acts with conviction, that refuses to question itself. You may think you're immune, that you'd never be swayed by baseless ideas, that you're enlightened, critical, attentive. But what if the real trap is precisely this certainty? Bonhoeffer suggested that the stupid person isn't the one who makes mistakes simply, but the one who no longer listens, who no longer reflects, who no longer acts on their own. And therefore they're no longer a person, they're an echo, a reflection of prevailing opinion, of ready-made phrases, of facile speeches, someone who no longer chooses, who merely repeats, and repetition, when automatic, ceases to be speech. It becomes noise. There's a kind of comfort in this, because thinking requires energy. It requires time. It requires confrontation. Thinking distances us from the group. Thinking makes us strangers. Questioning the obvious is dangerous. And so it's easier to give in, to let someone else say what's right, to let consensus guide us even if the path leads to destruction. Giving in to conventional wisdom is often less painful than facing the discomfort of becoming an exception. But this is where Bonhoeffer becomes unbearably relevant, because he didn't just write about the past. He wrote about what we still experience, about how in times of crisis, fear, and social pressure, stupidity becomes seductive, how it dresses up as patriotism, faith, and common sense, how it invites us to stop thinking in the name of a promise of security, how it offers comfort in exchange for the silent renunciation of lucidity. The truth is, none of us are completely protected. It doesn't matter how much we read, how much we study, how attentive we think we are. Stupidity stalks us precisely when we're most certain we're right. and the danger grows when the world rewards speed, shouting, and a ready response. We live surrounded by stimuli that demand speed, not depth, that reward reactions, not reflection, that manufacture opinions with the same efficiency with which goods are produced. Today, we live in an environment where reflection has become a luxury, where doubt is seen as weakness, where silence for thought is overwhelmed by the noise of sharing, where those who hesitate lose ground, and those who assert without knowing gain followers. We are, without realizing it, building a civilization that favors exactly what Bonhoeffer feared: mass intellectual surrender. A society where the act of thinking becomes subversive, where the courage to question is confused with disloyalty. That's why he insisted so much on one point: resistance requires more than knowledge. It requires character. It requires the willingness to pay the price for thinking, to accept the discomfort of not having all the answers, to prefer lucidity to acceptance, to walk alone when the group is heading toward error, to not negotiate one's own conscience, even if it costs applause, friendships, or even one's life. But there's a question that remains alive, pulsing, uncomfortable. How do we know when we've already begun to give in? When is the exact moment we stop thinking and start simply reacting? The problem is that functional stupidity doesn't present itself as ignorance. It presents itself as conviction, as certainty, as strength. And that's why it's so difficult to realize when we're already in it. That's why it grows silently, smiling, while we believe we're in control. Bonhoeffer believed that the first symptom is the inability to listen to others. When a different idea bothers us to the point that we don't even listen. When we no longer seek arguments, but only confirmation. When doubt offends us instead of provoking us. It is at this moment that thought begins to die. And where there is death of thought, there is fertile ground for all forms of manipulation. Because thought is the last bastion of freedom. When it yields, everything else becomes possible. Have you ever stopped to consider how much of what you believe is truly yours? How many of the ideas you hold were constructed by you, based on deep reflection, and not simply absorbed from the environment around you? How many times have you changed your mind in recent years? How many times have you preferred to listen rather than affirm? How many times have you acknowledged, "I was wrong"? How many times have you allowed yourself to not know rather than pretend to be certain? These questions are not accusations. They are invitations. Invitations to inner vigilance, to inner resistance, to the daily exercise of keeping alive the flame of independent thought. This flame that Bonhoeffer protected until his last breath, not with words alone, but with his life, with his imprisonment, with his death. Because in the end, it's not raw power that destroys a society. It's abandoned thinking. It's the mind that surrenders to automatism. It's the human being who forgets that being human is, above all, being able to think. Thinking not as a luxury, but as a moral duty, an act of responsibility before history. And now, I need to ask you, how many certainties do you carry that you've never tested? How many convictions have you inherited and never questioned? How many times have you said, "I know," when deep down you never knew? How many ideas have you defended just because everyone around you did the same? Think about it carefully, because the answer could be the beginning of your freedom, or the harbinger of a new form of imprisonment. In the next part, we will walk deeper into Bonhoeffer's eyes and understand how the collapse of thought becomes possible, not among ignorant fanatics, but among people who have learned to obey and forgotten to reflect. Have you ever wondered why so many good, intelligent, and even socially admired people committed unforgivable mistakes in the name of ideas we now consider absurd? This question haunts those who have the courage to look at history honestly. Dietrich Bonhoeffer did just that, and it was this courage that led him not only to exile from normality, but also to imprisonment and later to execution. He wasn't just a theologian. He was a man who dared to keep his conscience alive when most preferred to shut it down. In Nazi Germany, Bonhoeffer saw the collapse of thought unfold before his eyes. And it didn't happen among the poor or the ignorant, as many would like to believe. It happened among the most educated. Doctors, teachers, jurists, theologians, all bent their principles in the name of a new order. And what guided them wasn't outright hatred, nor even pure fear. It was something quieter, the surrender of critical consciousness. Bonhoeffer understood that these people weren't evil. They simply stopped thinking for themselves. They chose to obey. They chose to follow. They chose to survive within a system that rewarded conformity and punished lucidity. But how does this happen? How can someone who spent his life defending thought, the care for truth and ethics, suddenly support a destructive ideology? This is the question Bonhoeffer attempted to answer when he wrote his reflections from the confinement of a cell. The answer is as disturbing as it is simple. Thought doesn't disappear completely. It falls asleep. And while it sleeps, consciousness is replaced by a repeating machine. You might imagine someone who once championed free thought and, shortly after, begins repeating phrases like, "That's the way things are," or "There's nothing we can do," or even, "If everyone thinks so, it must be right." These phrases are common, but behind them Bonhoeffer saw the symptom of something serious. When a human being stops evaluating, comparing, and reflecting, they become a channel for a force they don't understand. They may even appear rational, but their decisions no longer come from within. They come from without. They become merely an obedient cog in a machine that no longer distinguishes right from wrong. In modern times, this process is even more dangerous because it is more subtle. It doesn't require uniforms, oaths, or explicit propaganda. It only requires distraction. Distraction is the new battlefield of consciousness. We live too busy to reflect, too overwhelmed to discern, too connected to listen to ourselves. And so, without realizing it, we become like those figures we so often judge in history, an everyday example. Imagine a person who grew up with solid values, who studied, who formed opinions over the years, and then they start consuming repetitive content. The same opinion, reinforced every day in the same tones, with the same words. Without realizing it, they begin to change. They begin to disregard different views. They begin to mock dialogue. You begin to distance yourself from those who disagree, until one day, this person no longer forms thoughts. They just repeat them, and they believe they're thinking. They believe they're conscious, but you're just comfortable inside a bubble constructed for convenience. Bonhoeffer saw blind obedience as one of the most dangerous forms of corruption of the soul, because it cloaks itself in the guise of normalcy. And what's normal tends to seem right. No one wakes up and decides to become an accomplice to evil. This happens when we fail to realize that we're already collaborating with it. Inaction, silence, indifference, all of these create the soil in which destructive ideologies flourish. And this soil is often too fertile in the hands of the well-intentioned. History is full of names who once remained silent out of prudence. People who preferred to wait, observe, let things pass. Many of them never imagined that their passivity would pave the way for so much destruction. And many, by the time they realized it, it was too late. Because time wasted in silence is time that strengthens error. Bonhoeffer warned of something even more subtle. Lying, when told often enough, doesn't just become acceptable, it becomes desirable. People come to like it, because lying simplifies. Lying comforts. Lying organizes the world in an easy way, where the enemy is clear, where the other person is to blame, where critical thinking is dispensable. And this is seductive. In times of crisis, human beings seek meaning, and where they don't find meaning, they create false certainties. But what makes Bonhoeffer's theory so disturbing is that he blamed not only those who lie, but also those who prefer not to hear the truth. Those who close their eyes because opening them would be uncomfortable. Those who avoid doubt because it requires effort. Those who flee conflict because it requires courage. These are the ones who, in silence, fuel collective stupidity. You may have felt this before. You may have experienced the discomfort of being in a group where everyone thinks alike and you dare to disagree. The sidelong glances, the subtle pressure, the feeling of betraying a shared identity. And then you fall silent, and in that silence, something breaks. Not for fear of reprisal, but for fear of being alone. The fear of exclusion is one of the most powerful tools against independent thought. Obedience isn't born solely from clear orders. It's born from the desire to belong, to not be the outsider, to not be the annoying one, to not be the one who complicates things. Bonhoeffer knew this, and that's why he chose to complicate things. He chose to be the thorn in the side of consensus. He chose to keep his conscience alive even when it meant losing everything. And perhaps the most powerful point of his reflection is this: what destroys freedom is not immediate violence, but the slow erosion of the courage to think. A society does not become authoritarian overnight. It becomes so when its citizens little by little stop asking questions, when they begin to prefer stability to truth, convenience to justice, comfort to lucidity. Today we have more access to information than ever before, but has this made us more conscious, or just quicker to repeat ourselves? Are we more critical, or just more reactive? Do we listen to understand, or just to respond? These are the questions Bonhoeffer would raise, and they still bleed, because thought requires time, silence, and depth. And today's world is the enemy of these three things. Every notification, every headline, every provocation pushes us away from ourselves. And the further away from ourselves, the closer to automatism, to autopilot, to a thoughtless response. That's why Bonhoeffer's memory still burns. Because he wasn't just a voice, he was a mirror. He showed us what we are when we let go of being. He showed us that evil doesn't need to convince us. It just needs us to stop thinking. And now, perhaps the hardest question of all: how many times have you obeyed? Not out of conviction, but out of fear. How many times have you swallowed a silence that you knew would hurt you inside, but chose not to break the mood? How many times have you pretended to agree so as not to be the problem at the table? And how many of those times have you felt like something inside you had died a little there? This is the death Bonhoeffer feared most. Not physical death, but the death of the critical mind, the death of the thinking soul, the death of the dignity that only reflection sustains. Ultimately, we are responsible not only for what we do, but also for what we accept without question. And this kind of acceptance, this kind of subtle obedience, is what opens the door to humanity's worst chapters. In the next part, we'll understand how power structures no longer need to impose silence. They simply need to make thinking a solitary, tiring, and futile endeavor. And in this new scenario, stupidity not only survives, it strengthens and organizes itself. It's easy to imagine that power structures operate through brute force, direct censorship, or physical coercion. But today's world has a more efficient, and therefore more dangerous strategy. It no longer needs to silence by force. It simply empties the meaning of reflection. It's enough to make thinking seem useless, or tiring, or lonely. And it's in this terrain of apparent freedom that functional stupidity thrives. Bonhoeffer already intuited this in his writings. There's no need to force anyone to obey. Simply create an environment where disobedience becomes too much effort. Where doubt demands energy no one wants to expend. We live in an era where the amount of information is overwhelming. We have access to knowledge like no previous generation. But paradoxically, we are increasingly less equipped to process this knowledge in depth. Excess has become noise. The abundance of data has created a new form of scarcity. A scarcity of attention, of focus, of pause. The problem isn't a lack of content, but a lack of digestion. We consume ideas like mental fast food, fast, addictive, and nutritionally insignificant. Have you ever stopped to think about how many opinions you've formed based solely on headlines? How many decisions you've made based on titles, excerpts, or comments? And most frighteningly, how many of those decisions did you actually believe were your own? This question touches on a point Bonhoeffer made with almost surgical precision. Many people don't think, they just absorb. And when we absorb without digesting, there is no real conviction, only conditioning. Modern conditioning doesn't require shouting or threats. It occurs silently, through algorithms, stimuli, and subtle repetitions. It acts like a slow tide that gradually shapes the contours of our consciousness until no contours of its own remain. Imagine a person who spends all day browsing social media. They're not being forced into anything. They're free. Free to choose what they see, what they read, what they share. But is this freedom real? Is what they choose truly being chosen? Or is it being suggested, induced, programmed? Bonhoeffer never lived in the digital age, but he would perfectly understand this new form of domination, because for him, the problem was never the content, but the passivity in the face of it. And when this passivity becomes the norm, critical thinking becomes the exception. Consider for a moment the architecture of the digital platforms we use every day. They were created for engagement, not lucidity, for attention, not depth, for reaffirmation, not doubt. Every like, every comment, every click is a quick reward that trains us to react, not reflect. It's a daily training for functional stupidity, and the more we're rewarded for impulsive reactions, the harder it becomes to maintain the calm of analysis. When was the last time you disagreed with something your entire social circle seemed to support? When was the last time you decided not to share information because you weren't sure it was true, even though you knew it would make you look smart or engaged? Bonhoeffer spoke of the difficulty of sustaining an independent consciousness in a world that has already chosen its path. And today, more than ever, sustaining this consciousness is an almost heroic act of resistance. Not for lack of resources, but for an excess of distractions. Not for direct repression, but for indirect sedation. We are intoxicated by stimuli, and this intoxication drives us away from lucidity with the same force that fear drove dissidents from the Nazi regime. The new form of control is comfortable. It adapts to our weariness. It understands our desire for simple certainties, for short answers, for strong statements. It offers us exactly that, and with a pleasing aesthetic, with humor, with irony, with belonging. It has become more acceptable to appear informed than to actually be, more effective to appear aware than to act consciously. Bonhoeffer knew that this kind of moral decay begins not with great crimes, but with small concessions. An opinion we accept without question, a joke that reinforces a prejudice, a silence where there should be discomfort. Why do we remain silent in the face of absurdity? Why do we passively watch the rise of misinformation, shallow narratives, and emotional manipulation, and do nothing? Perhaps because we believe that thinking is pointless, that arguing changes nothing, that reflecting is a waste of time. And that's precisely where the system triumphs, when it convinces us that effort is futile. Bonhoeffer believed the opposite. He believed that every thought kept alive was a resistance, that every conscience preserved was a spark, that every silence refused was a way of maintaining dignity. He didn't expect to save everyone. He fought not to lose himself. Imagine if today, faced with so many crises, someone were to say, "The biggest problem is not the lie, but the mind that no longer distinguishes truth from lies." This is, in essence, Bonhoeffer's thesis, and it applies even more powerfully to our time. Because now lies don't need to be imposed. They are shared, liked, monetized. They spread not because they are convincing, but because they are convenient. The system knows this, and it operates with this logic. A logic where the fastest wins over the most sensible, where the most emotional wins over the most rational, where the loudest wins over the most profound. It's a rigged game where functional stupidity isn't just tolerated, it's celebrated. Have you ever wondered why so many intelligent people believe in clearly misguided ideas? Have you ever stopped to observe how professionals, educated and successful, can fall into childish cognitive traps? The explanation isn't a lack of education, it's excessive conditioning. It's the continuous erosion of one's own thinking. It's the repetition that replaces analysis. Bonhoeffer warned us, when the structure of society favors blind obedience, independent thought becomes not only rare but punished. Today, the punishment isn't physical, it's symbolic. It's exclusion, cancellation, ridicule. And for fear of rejection, many of us prefer the comfort of automatic compliance, the silence that preserves belonging. But at what cost? Is the price of belonging worth the sacrifice of clarity? Is remaining inside a bubble worth more than facing reality with all its discomforts? Does being accepted justify no longer being whole? These questions push us out of our comfort zone, and that's where Bonhoeffer becomes more necessary than ever, because he doesn't offer easy answers. He demands courage, he demands depth, he demands a daily choice. not to be complicit in the collective numbness. When was the last time you went silent to truly think? Not to judge, not to plan a response, but to hear what you really think. When was the last time you doubted something you've believed for years? When was the last time you read something that disconcerted you and didn't rush to reject it, but allowed yourself to feel the discomfort of doubt? This is the practice Bonhoeffer advocated. Thought as a spiritual discipline, doubt as a form of maturity, listening as a form of resistance. Not to appear superior, but to remain human. Because the first thing to die in functional stupidity is not the intellect, it's humanity. And if all this seems too demanding, perhaps it is. But the cost of not thinking is much higher, because it doesn't pay off immediately. It takes its toll in interest. It takes its toll in wasted time, in destroyed relationships, in societies that become uninhabitable. Bonhoeffer died by hanging, but his voice still resonates because he understood before many that thought is a form of faith. Faith in truth, faith in lucidity, faith in the possibility of resistance even when everything around demands surrender. This faith doesn't require religion. It requires commitment, consistency, attention. In the next part, we will explore how modern systems of power have learned to manufacture ignorance in an organized way, and how stupidity has gone from being an individual mistake to becoming mass politics, silent, profitable, and nearly invisible. What Bonhoeffer never saw, but somehow sensed, was that one day stupidity would cease to be merely a lapse in judgment and become a business model. What he identified as the suspension of consciousness in times of crisis is now a mass-distributed product, packaged with technological precision and delivered directly to our vulnerable attention. It is no longer necessary for someone to order silence. It is enough for the noise to be constant. It is no longer necessary for error to be imposed. It is enough for it to be repeated until it becomes comfortable. We live in an age where ignorance no longer needs to be imposed. It's encouraged. And this encouragement comes precisely from the structures that, theoretically, should expand our awareness. Digital platforms don't operate with the goal of enlightenment. They operate with the goal of captivating. And to captivate, they need to be predictable, emotional, engaging, and simple. The truth is rarely simple. The truth requires context. It requires nuance. It requires effort. And effort is the enemy of attention. So the system makes a choice. If the truth is difficult, it's better to replace it with something more palatable. And if that something is useful for engagement, so much the better. This silent mechanism turns stupidity into a cycle where emotion precedes thought, where reaction trumps analysis, where shock replaces content. The system doesn't require you to be stupid. It only requires that you don't stop, don't question, don't doubt, that you keep turning the gears of consumption, posting, and superficial indignation. And in this rotation, consciousness dissolves. Bonhoeffer would recognize this process because he didn't see stupidity as a problem of intelligence, but as a moral failing. A failing that arises when human beings decide to abdicate their responsibility to discern. In 1940s Germany, this abdication cost lives. Today, it costs something more subtle, but equally devastating. The collective ability to distinguish the real from the fabricated, the just from the convenient, the human from the programmed. Artificial intelligence doesn't think. It calculates, it simulates, and it does so with speed, precision, and effortlessness. It learns our preferences, anticipates our choices, and offers us exactly what we want to see. It seems efficient, and it is. But this efficiency comes at a high price. The dilution of surprise, contradiction, and the unexpected, the very elements that provoke reflection. The algorithm doesn't want you to think. It wants you to stay, to continue, to react. And to do so, it adjusts the world to your needs, reinforces your beliefs, isolates your doubts, and builds a perfectly comfortable bubble around you. Bonhoeffer, even without knowing the language of codes, understood the logic of the systems that domesticate thought. He knew that when a society begins to reward convenience over truth, it enters a path of silent decay. And this decay doesn't happen explosively. It's gradual. It spreads like a mist. Each day, a little more thought is replaced by automatism. A little more doubt is replaced by slogans. A little more ethics is exchanged for engagement. If in the past, ignorance was a consequence of lack of access, today it is the result of excess. An excess of content, of stimulation, of distraction. An excess that prevents us from delving deeper, from questioning, from pausing. We have never been so connected and at the same time so scattered. We have never had so many tools to learn and so little willingness to reflect. The system knows this and profits from it. How many times have you felt well informed but couldn't sustain an idea for more than 3 minutes without resorting to your phone? How many times have you shared something that seemed right to you simply because everyone else was sharing it too? How many times have you avoided a debate not for lack of arguments but out of exhaustion? These small daily sacrifices are what, combined, fuel functional stupidity. And this kind of stupidity isn't noticed at the beginning. It's noticed at the end when it's too late to turn back. Bonhoeffer died because he refused this process, because he chose to be uncomfortable, because he preferred lucidity to comfort, because he decided to pay the price to keep his consciousness awake. He believed that thought is not just a mental function, but an ethical requirement. That reflection is not a privilege, but a duty, and that renouncing thought is renouncing humanity itself. Today, that kind of choice seems distant. After all, no one is threatening us with guns. No one is taking us to prison for our ideas. But there is another form of imprisonment, one that occurs in the silence of adaptation, in the normalization of the absurd, in the acceptance of the superficial. It is an invisible but real captivity. The trivialization of error, the glorification of ignorance, the aestheticization of futility. All of this creates a scenario where stupidity not only survives but becomes the norm. And when the collective standard is the absence of thought, the individual who dares to think begins to seem strange, inconvenient, antisocial, perhaps even dangerous. Bonhoeffer would become a silent profile today. Perhaps he would be banned for violating guidelines. Perhaps he would be attacked in the comments for being too negative. Perhaps he would be ignored for not generating engagement. But his message remains the same. The price of freedom is vigilance. And vigilance in today's world is not about looking outward. It's about looking inward. It's about resisting the temptation to constantly react. It's about cultivating the silence that allows you to think. It's about disconnecting to reconnect with something the system cannot manipulate: your own consciousness. What you consume, day after day, shapes your perception of the world. It shapes the way you judge, feel, and decide. There is no neutrality in continuous exposure. Every image, every sentence, every news item has an effect. And when these effects are added together, they transform the way you see yourself, others, and reality. Thinking requires realizing this. It requires breaking out of autopilot. It requires interrupting the flow, even if only for a moment. The algorithm doesn't want your silence. It wants your click. It wants your impulse. And the more immediate your reaction, the more profitable you become. But the faster your response, the less time your consciousness has had to exist. Functional stupidity is, therefore, this silent machine that sucks your attention, numbs your ethics, drains your autonomy, and transforms it into engagement. Bonhoeffer left us a warning. Intelligence is not enough. Technical knowledge is no antidote to manipulation. Many of those who collaborated with authoritarian regimes were educated. Many of those who promote disinformation today have degrees. The stupidity Bonhoeffer fought was that which chose obedience out of convenience, that which avoided doubt out of fear, that which embraced lies out of weariness. When you ask yourself why so many people fall for absurd rhetoric, the answer may not lie solely in the content of these discourses, but in the structure that sustains them. A structure that rewards those who speak loudest, not those who think best. That promotes those who please the algorithm, not those who face error. That seduces with the appearance of truth, but refuses to bear the weight of complexity. So every time you resist the urge to comment without thinking, to share without verifying, to believe without questioning, You are exercising what Bonhoeffer would call fidelity to conscience. It's not about being superior. It's about not being swept away. It's about maintaining a fixed point while everything else is spinning around. And if you think this doesn't make a difference, think again. Because every person who thinks, who analyzes, who hesitates before acting, becomes a living obstacle to programmed idiocy. They become a seed of lucidity in a soil that tries to suffocate any form of discernment. In the next part, we will understand how this individual lucidity can transform into collective action, and how thought, when cultivated in community, can interrupt the cycle of stupidity, even when it already seems irreversible. There comes a time when silence becomes a choice, a time when inaction is no longer neutrality, but complicity. Bonhoeffer knew this, and that's why he remained standing when everyone else knelt. Thinking for him wasn't a philosophical option or an intellectual luxury. It was the only way to resist the collapse of human dignity. It was the last bastion of true freedom, the kind that depends not on words, but on awakened consciousness. You've made it this far. You've read or heard every word, and perhaps at some point along this journey, you've felt something hard to name, a restlessness, a memory, a shame, or even pain. Don't run from it. This is a sign that you're still alive inside, that your consciousness hasn't surrendered, and it's from this spark that everything can begin. Because it's this small, silent pain that shows us that something inside us still resists, still cries out for meaning, for authenticity, for truth. But what now? What to do with all this? What to do when you understand the weight of your own passivity? When you recognize that the greatest danger may not be out there, but within each of us, the moment we stop thinking autonomously? Bonhoeffer was not an idealist far from reality. He was a man surrounded by fear, repression, and loneliness. And yet, he wrote with lucidity and courage until the end. His words were not meant to impress. They were meant to sustain, to strengthen the spirit of those who refused to succumb to emptiness. Inspired by him, I propose a plan here. Simple, yet concrete. A set of practical actions for you to not only understand what was said, but to live it. Turn each idea into a choice, and each choice a form of presence in the world. Start with yourself. Create the habit of pausing. Once a day, for 10 minutes. Sit in silence. No cell phone, no music, no notifications. Just you and your thoughts. Observe what arises. You don't need to control or resolve anything. Just listen to your mind without distractions. This exercise, repeated over the weeks, strengthens mental autonomy. You relearn to listen to what you think without external filters. And this practice, simple at first glance, is revolutionary in a world that thrives on distraction. Over time, this pause becomes an internal refuge, a fortress where thought regains its power. So, challenge your certainties. Choose an idea you hold firmly, anyone, and take the time to seek out counter-arguments. Read authors with opposing views. Listen without the intention of refuting. Just listen. The goal isn't to change your mind. It's to test the depth of your conviction. True ideas don't fear confrontation, and fragile ideas need to be refreshed before they become dogma. This exercise isn't a threat to your identity, but an exercise in intellectual humility, a gesture of respect for what we don't yet know. The third step, slow down your reaction. When you read something that angers you, moves you, or makes you want to respond immediately, wait, breathe, count to 60. During this time, ask yourself, what would I gain by reacting now? Does this contribute something, or does it just make me appear proactive? Most quick responses aren't born from awareness. They're born from impulsivity, and impulsivity is the preferred breeding ground for manipulation. By slowing down, you regain control, and in that control, lucidity reappears. Emotional haste is the mother of mistakes. Pausing is the cradle of wisdom. The fourth step is collective. Choose one person each week to listen deeply to. It could be a friend, a colleague, a relative, someone you don't quite agree with, or who lives in a different world than you. Ask something truthful and listen carefully, without interrupting, without waiting for your turn to speak. Just listen. Active listening is a powerful antidote to collective stupidity. It rehumanizes the other. And it reminds us that thinking is also about building bridges. It's a gesture of resistance against the culture of monologue, where everyone talks and no one really listens. And finally, practice what Bonhoeffer called costly grace. The willingness to do the right thing even when it costs. It costs time. It costs friendships. It costs followers. It costs peace of mind. But it also liberates, because those who think courageously live at peace with their own conscience. This peace isn't comfortable, but it is solid. It's the peace of those who can look in the mirror and recognize that despite their flaws, they haven't shied away from their duty to think. This is the grace of those who know that the truth doesn't comfort, but liberates. This plan doesn't transform the world immediately, but it transforms you. And when you change, your outlook changes, your speech changes, your decisions change. And little by little, you become a point of resistance in a society that only wants continuity, a point of silent rupture, a living reminder that there are still people who haven't given up. And that's what history always remembers. It was the small gestures of lucidity that ignited great changes. You might think, but it's so little compared to so much. Yes, it's little, but it's what's within our reach. And Bonhoeffer taught us that when everything seems overwhelmed, the smallest resistance can be the beginning of something greater. That a single lit candle is enough to remind us that darkness isn't absolute, that an awakened consciousness can illuminate many others around it, even without saying a word. If you've made it this far, know this: you're part of a minority that still cares, and this minority matters more than you realize. Because it's from this minority that new consciousnesses, new examples, and new paths emerge. The future won't be shaped by those who go with the flow. It will be shaped by those who, in silence, choose to remain whole. Not out of arrogance, but out of love for truth, out of loyalty to humanity itself. Now it's up to you. Practice pausing. Question your certainties. Slow down your reactions. Listen carefully, and have the courage to pay the price for thinking. Do this not to appear superior, but to remain human. In a world that rewards intellectual surrender, thinking has become a radical act. And if you commit to it, even discreetly, you'll already be doing more than many. You'll be planting seeds of lucidity in a soil thirsting for meaning. Leave your mark here. Write in the comments a question, an experience, or an issue that arose throughout this series. You can be anonymous if you prefer, but write. Sharing is part of the process. And if this video touched you in any way, like it, subscribe to the Deep Psyche channel, and turn on notifications. This helps us continue producing content like this, which requires time, research, and heart. Every gesture of support strengthens this space for reflection. You don't have to change the whole world, but you can start with yourself, and sometimes that's more than enough. Because one human being who thinks courageously is more subversive than 1,000 who shout without conscience. Thank you for being here, for listening, for thinking, for not giving up. Until the next chapter.